Marcus Jordan had always believed that hard work was the key to success. But when his history teacher, Mr. Harris, scribbled those 4 fateful words on his carefully crafted essay, "You people should aim lower," he realized that no amount of effort could protect him from the invisible wall of prejudice. What Marcus didn't know was that the quiet battle he would fight was about to set off a chain of events that would shake the entire school. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. It was a bright Monday morning, the kind that usually lifted Marcus Jordan's spirits. He loved school, loved the challenge of learning something new each day, and thrived on the satisfaction of solving problems and mastering material that others might find difficult. At 12, Marcus was wise beyond his years, both academically and emotionally. He carried with him a quiet strength, instilled by his parents, Daniel and Lisa Jordan. They had always told him to approach life with curiosity, kindness, and respect, but also to be aware that the world would not always be fair to him. Marcus's father, Daniel, was a well-known attorney, highly respected in his field. His mother, Lisa, had left her job in corporate America to raise Marcus, teaching him the importance of self-worth, dignity, and hard work. However, they hadn't yet fully prepared him for what he was about to face. On this particular morning, Marcus was excited to turn in an essay he had worked on for weeks, a deep dive into an important historical event that he found fascinating. He had poured hours into researching, reading, and making sure his arguments were solid. It wasn't just another school assignment to him. It was something he felt proud of, something he thought would earn him the kind of recognition and encouragement that he had always received from his parents. Mr. Harris, however, had other plans. Mr. Harris had been teaching at the school for over a decade. His classroom, decorated with historical posters and textbooks, seemed inviting on the surface, but for students like Marcus, it often felt cold and unwelcome. Mr. Harris wasn't overtly cruel, but his behavior carried undertones of bias that Marcus was starting to notice. That morning, Marcus walked confidently to Mr. Harris's desk and handed in his essay. The teacher took it without a word, barely glancing up from his laptop. Marcus didn't expect much of a response. Mr. Harris wasn't one for friendly exchanges, but he did expect that his effort would be fairly judged. After all, he had worked as hard as any other student, if not harder. The next day, the essays were returned. Marcus eagerly flipped through the pages, his heart racing in anticipation. His essay was marked with red pen in several places, more than usual, but that wasn't what hit him. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in Mr. Harris's nearly illegible handwriting, were the words, "You people should aim for more realistic goals." Marcus blinked, unsure if he had read it correctly. You people? What did that mean? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the comment. Did Mr. Harris think he wasn't smart enough to write this kind of essay? Did he believe Marcus wasn't capable of achieving academic success? The words hung in the air, heavy with implications that Marcus, in his young mind, struggled to fully grasp. At lunch, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling. He didn't mention it to his friends. He didn't want to make a big deal out of something that could just be a misunderstanding. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't what he thought it was. But deep down, Marcus knew. He could feel the sting of those words, even if he couldn't fully articulate why they hurt so much. When he got home that evening, Marcus laid the essay on the kitchen counter while his mother was cooking dinner. Lisa glanced at it, noticing the red ink immediately. She put down the wooden spoon she was using to stir a pot of stew and wiped her hands on a dish towel before picking up the paper. "What did Mr. Harris write here?" she asked, squinting to read the comment at the bottom. Marcus hesitated, unsure if he should say anything, but his mother's face said it all. Lisa's expression darkened as she read the words, her usually warm eyes narrowing in concern. "You people," she whispered, her voice thick with disappointment. Marcus stood there, waiting for her to say something more, to explain what he was feeling, but couldn't quite put into words. Lisa set the paper down carefully and took a deep breath before turning to her son. "Honey, do you know what he meant by that?" she asked gently. "I think so," Marcus replied, his voice soft. "But I'm not sure." Lisa sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for Marcus to join her. She explained in the most delicate way she could that sometimes people made judgments about others based on their appearance, or in this case, their race. She didn't want to burden him with the harsh realities of the world too early, but she also knew it was important for Marcus to understand what he was dealing with. "It's not fair, Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And it's not right. But you have to know that this isn't about you. It's about him. People like Mr. Harris, they don't see the whole picture. They only see what they want to see. But that doesn't change who you are or what you can achieve." Marcus nodded, though the weight of the conversation sat heavy in his chest. He didn't know how to feel. Angry, confused, maybe even a little ashamed, though he couldn't figure out why. It wasn't his fault. He knew that. But still, the words had left a mark. Lisa hugged him tightly, sensing his inner turmoil. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "Just remember that your worth isn't determined by what anyone else thinks." That night, Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his essay, about Mr. Harris, and about the comment that had shaken him. For the first time in his life, Marcus questioned whether all his hard work would ever be enough. Was there a point to trying so hard if people like Mr. Harris would always judge him by the color of his skin? But then he thought about his parents, about their strength, and about how much they believed in him. They had always taught him to persevere, to stand tall, and to never let anyone define his value. And so, despite the doubt gnawing at him, Marcus made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let Mr. Harris or anyone else dictate what he could achieve. Still, the wound was there, and though Marcus couldn't see it, it would continue to fester in the days to come, shaping the challenges he would face and the decisions he would make. He had no idea that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The days after Mr. Harris's comment passed slowly for Marcus. Though he tried to shake it off, the words clung to him like a heavy fog, clouding his thoughts every time he walked into history class. His classmates seemed oblivious to the subtle tensions, laughing and talking as usual, but for Marcus, something had changed. He no longer looked forward to school with the same excitement, and history, once his favorite subject, now filled him with a sense of dread. Mr. Harris didn't stop with just one comment. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began to notice a pattern in the way his teacher treated him. It was never obvious or loud, but always present, like an unspoken shadow hovering over every interaction. Whenever Marcus raised his hand to answer a question, Mr. Harris would pause, hesitate, and then call on someone else. When Marcus was chosen to participate, the questions were noticeably more difficult, and his answers were often met with skepticism, as though Mr. Harris didn't believe he was capable of giving the right response. The worst part was the subtle praise Mr. Harris showered on other students who didn't look like Marcus. A simple answer would earn them a "well done" or a "good thinking," but when Marcus spoke, it was always met with a short, clipped, not quite," even when he knew he was right. It was as if Mr. Harris was determined to undermine his confidence at every turn. At first, Marcus tried to push these thoughts aside. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was being too sensitive. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. The pattern was too clear, the slights too consistent. Marcus began to dread going to history class. He would sit at his desk, head down, trying to make himself invisible. The subject he once loved became a source of anxiety, and his performance began to suffer as a result. His grades, which had always been strong, began to slip, and the more they did, the more Mr. Harris seemed to confirm his own biased assumptions. But Marcus wasn't the only one who noticed the change. At home, his parents began to see the shift in his behavior. Marcus, who had always been chatty and enthusiastic about school, now came home quiet and withdrawn. He spent more time in his room, sometimes with his door shut, something he had never done before. His father, Daniel, was the first to ask him about it one evening while they were watching television together. "Hey, Marcus," Daniel said, turning down the volume on the TV. "Everything okay with school? You've been pretty quiet lately." Marcus shrugged, not wanting to meet his father's gaze. "It's fine, I guess," he mumbled. Daniel studied him for a moment. "You guess?" he repeated gently. "That doesn't sound like the Marcus I know. What's going on?" There was a long pause. Marcus didn't want to tell his father what had been happening. He didn't want to sound like a complainer, and part of him felt embarrassed for letting Mr. Harris's behavior get to him. But when he looked up and saw the concern in his father's eyes, he couldn't hold it in any longer. "It's Mr. Harris," Marcus finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He treats me differently." Daniel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Differently how?" Marcus hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I don't know. It's like he doesn't think I'm smart enough or something. He keeps making these comments, and no matter what I do, it's never good enough. He's always putting me down, but he's nice to the other kids." Daniel sat quietly for a moment, processing what Marcus had said. His jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice calm. "Has he said anything specific to you?" he asked. Marcus nodded and told his father about the comment Mr. Harris had written on his essay, the one about aiming for more realistic goals. He explained how it made him feel, how it seemed like Mr. Harris was always waiting for him to fail, and how it was getting harder and harder to stay motivated in class. As he spoke, the floodgates opened, and all the frustration he had been holding inside came pouring out. "I just don't get it," Marcus said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I try so hard, and it's like he doesn't even care. He's always giving me harder questions, and when I do answer, he acts like I'm wrong even when I'm not. It's not fair." Daniel's heart ached as he listened to his son's words. He had hoped that Marcus wouldn't have to face this kind of discrimination so early in life, but he had always known it was a possibility. He had dealt with similar situations in his own life, rising through the ranks in a legal world that wasn't always welcoming to men who looked like him. But hearing it from Marcus, his smart, kind, hard-working son, cut deeper than he had expected. Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Marcus, what you're describing, it sounds like Mr. Harris is treating you unfairly because of who you are, not because of your work." Marcus stared at his father, a lump forming in his throat. "You mean because I'm black?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, and it's not right. It's never right. But sometimes people make judgments about us based on things that have nothing to do with who we really are. It's their problem, not yours. But it's also not something you should have to face alone." Marcus felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "What am I supposed to do about it?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I can't make him stop. He's the teacher. He's in charge." Daniel leaned forward, resting a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're right. You can't control what Mr. Harris does, but you can control how you respond. You're stronger than he thinks, Marcus. Don't let him make you feel small." Marcus swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "But it's not fair, Dad. Why should I have to deal with this? Why should anyone?" "I know, son," Daniel said softly. "It's not fair, but you don't have to deal with it alone. We'll figure out the best way to handle this. You've done nothing wrong, and you deserve to be treated with respect. We'll make sure that happens." The conversation left Marcus feeling both relieved and unsettled. He was grateful to have his father's support, but the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on him. The next day, as he sat in Mr. Harris's class, the teacher's usual tone of condescension grated on him even more than before. It felt like every comment, every dismissive glance, was amplified. At lunchtime, Marcus sat quietly at his usual table with his friends. He wasn't in the mood to talk much, and his friends picked up on it, giving him space without asking questions. But as the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Marcus felt a pit of dread forming in his stomach. He had history class next. Walking into the classroom, Marcus found his seat and tried to focus. Today, the lesson was about civil rights leaders, a subject that usually fascinated Marcus. But as Mr. Harris started the lecture, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that every word was tinged with hypocrisy. How could Mr. Harris teach about equality and justice when he couldn't even treat all of his students fairly? As the class went on, Marcus's mind wandered. He thought about what his father had said, about how he could control his own actions, even if he couldn't control Mr. Harris's. But what could he do? How could he stand up to a teacher without getting into trouble? And even if he did speak out, would anyone listen? The silent struggle continued, and Marcus felt more lost than ever. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The slow burn of frustration had been building in Marcus for weeks. Mr. Harris's treatment was no longer just a subtle nuisance. It had grown into a full-blown burden. Every day felt like a test of endurance. Marcus would walk into history class knowing that whatever he said, whatever he did, Mr. Harris would find a way to undermine it. The once eager and confident student was now a shadow of himself in this room, always guarded, always waiting for the next blow. But today something felt different. As Marcus slid into his usual seat at the back of the classroom, he felt the weight of all the previous weeks bearing down on him. His mother's encouragement and his father's wisdom had helped him keep going this long. But today, Marcus wasn't sure if he had the strength to sit through one more class with Mr. Harris. The lesson that day was supposed to be about leadership and change, focusing on notable figures who had shaped history. Marcus had studied these topics extensively. He admired these leaders, people who had stood against injustice and fought for their rights. As Mr. Harris began to speak, Marcus listened with a mixture of interest and skepticism. Could this teacher, who so blatantly dismissed Marcus's potential, really have the audacity to lecture them on people who had overcome prejudice? Mr. Harris paced the room, speaking in his usual condescending tone, only now Marcus heard it louder than ever. These leaders, Mr. Harris said, knew how to navigate the challenges of their time. They didn't waste energy on things they couldn't control. They focused on realistic goals. He paused, scanning the room before his gaze landed squarely on Marcus. The words realistic goals echoed in Marcus's mind, taking him back to the comment Mr. Harris had written on his essay weeks earlier. You people should aim for more realistic goals. The memory stung like it had just happened. Something inside Marcus snapped. His hand shot up. This time there was no hesitation. He didn't wait to be called on. He just spoke. Mr. Harris, Marcus said, his voice steady but loud enough to turn a few heads. Can you explain what you mean by realistic goals? Because I don't understand how people can make progress if they don't dream bigger than what's expected of them. The room fell silent. The other students, who were usually only half engaged in the lecture, suddenly seemed to be paying attention. Mr. Harris paused in his pacing, looking at Marcus with a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Mr. Harris began, his voice strained with forced patience, that some people need to be realistic about their limitations. Not everyone can achieve everything they set their minds to. It's just the way the world works. There it was again, that word, limitations. And once again, Marcus could feel the weight of what Mr. Harris was implying. But this time, he wasn't going to let it slide. Who decides what's realistic? Marcus asked, his voice growing stronger. People like you? Just because someone doesn't fit into the box you've put them in, doesn't mean they're not capable of more. The tension in the room was palpable now. Harris's face darkened, and he took a step toward Marcus's desk. I don't appreciate your tone, Marcus. You're being disrespectful. Disrespectful? Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could standing up for himself be considered disrespectful? I'm just asking a question, Marcus replied, his heart pounding in his chest. How is that disrespectful? Mr. Harris's expression hardened. If you don't stop this attitude right now, I'll send you to the principal's office. The threat hung in the air, but Marcus wasn't backing down. Something inside him told him that this moment was bigger than just him. He wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up against something that had been wrong for too long. So you can't answer my question? Marcus pressed, refusing to break eye contact with his teacher. Mr. Harris slammed his hand down on Marcus's desk. That's it. Go to the principal's office now. The sound of Mr. Harris's voice startled the room. Marcus's classmates were wide-eyed, watching the scene unfold with a mix of surprise and curiosity. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He stood up slowly, grabbing his backpack, and walked out of the classroom without another word. The hallway felt long and empty as Marcus made his way to the principal's office. With each step, his heart pounded harder. He knew he'd likely be in trouble, but at this point, it didn't matter. He had spoken the truth, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sense of relief. Principal Robinson's office was quiet when Marcus entered. The principal, a tall man with a calm demeanor, looked up from his desk as Marcus approached. "Marcus," he said, his voice neutral but curious, "what brings you here?" Marcus sat down, taking a deep breath. He explained everything, how Mr. Harris had been treating him unfairly, the comments, the condescending tone, the constant pressure to prove himself. He recounted how it had all come to a head today, and how he had finally reached his breaking point. Principal Robinson listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Marcus finished, there was a long pause. Finally, the principal leaned forward, folding his hands on his desk. "I've heard some concerns about Mr. Harris before," Principal Robinson said slowly, choosing his words with care. "But nothing quite like this. Are you sure you're not misinterpreting things?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. This was exactly what he had feared. The subtle dismissal, the implication that he might be imagining the whole thing. "I'm not misinterpreting anything," Marcus said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "This isn't just about today. It's been going on for weeks. He treats me differently because of who I am." Principal Robinson nodded slightly, though his eyes still held doubt. "I understand this is upsetting for you, Marcus, but these are serious accusations. I'll need to look into this before making any decisions." The words felt hollow. Marcus had expected this, a brush-off, an assurance that something would be done, but with no real action behind it. Still, he nodded, standing up to leave the office. "Thank you for coming to me," Principal Robinson added as Marcus reached the door. "We'll talk again soon." Marcus left the office feeling a mix of emotions, anger, disappointment, but also a strange sense of pride. He had stood up for himself. Whether or not Principal Robinson took it seriously, Marcus knew he had done the right thing. He wasn't going to let people like Mr. Harris define him or make him feel small. When he got home that afternoon, Marcus told his parents everything. Lisa listened, her face tight with worry. Daniel, however, listened in silence, his expression unreadable until Marcus had finished. "So what do you think will happen now?" Marcus asked, looking to his father for guidance. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "I think it's time for me to step in," he said finally. "Not as your father, but as someone who knows how to handle this." Marcus felt a surge of relief. He knew his father wasn't someone who made empty promises. If Daniel Jordan was getting involved, then things were about to change. But Marcus also felt a ripple of anxiety. What would happen next? Would Mr. Harris face any consequences? Would the school really do anything to address the issue? Marcus didn't have the answers yet. But one thing was certain. The days of Mr. Harris's unchecked behavior were coming to an end. As Marcus sat in his room that evening, replaying the events of the day in his mind, he realized that standing up for himself had changed something inside him. The fear and self-doubt that had been weighing him down were slowly starting to lift. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt hopeful. He had spoken his truth, and now it was time to see what the consequences of that truth would be. And somewhere deep inside him, Marcus knew that justice was coming, whether Mr. Harris was ready for it or not. That night, after Marcus explained everything that had happened with Mr. Harris to his parents, Daniel Jordan sat quietly in his office. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the edge of his desk, and his mind churned with a mixture of frustration and resolve. The story Marcus had shared brought back painful memories, times when Daniel himself had faced subtle but insidious discrimination in his own career, even as a successful attorney. But this wasn't about him now, it was about his son, and that made the situation all the more personal. Lisa, who had been pacing in the living room, finally came into the office, her face tight with concern. "What are we going to do about this?" she asked, her voice low but fierce. "Marcus can't keep dealing with this alone. It's not right." Daniel looked up at his wife, his expression calm but determined. "We're not going to let this slide," he said. "But we have to be smart about how we handle it. This isn't just about Marcus, it's about ensuring that people like Mr. Harris don't get away with this kind of behavior ever again." Lisa nodded, knowing her husband's mind was already working on a plan. She had always admired Daniel's ability to navigate difficult situations with a steady hand. But this situation wasn't just a case he was taking on. This was their son. "What's your first step?" Lisa asked, sitting down beside him, her hands ringing slightly in her lap. "I'm going to start by contacting the school board," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm. "But before I do that, I'll gather more information. We need a clear picture of what's been happening, and not just from Marcus's perspective. If this has been going on for weeks, chances are it's not just Marcus who's been affected. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. You think other students might have noticed or experienced the same thing? I'd bet on it, Daniel said. People like Mr. Harris don't limit their prejudice to just one person. If he's doing this to Marcus, he's likely treating other students similarly. If we can get statements or evidence from others, it will strengthen our case. Lisa sighed, leaning back in the chair. I just hate that Marcus has to deal with this. He's such a good kid, and he works so hard. It's infuriating that one teacher can make him feel like he's not good enough. I know, Daniel said softly, but we're going to turn this around. He's not alone in this. We'll make sure that Marcus knows he has people in his corner. The next morning, Daniel made his first move. He didn't storm into the school or make any immediate public accusations. His years as an attorney had taught him the importance of gathering facts before acting. Instead, he began quietly reaching out to parents of other students in Mr. Harris's class. He wanted to know if anyone else had noticed anything unusual, if their children had mentioned anything about how Mr. Harris treated them. At first, the responses were mixed. Most parents hadn't paid much attention to the day-to-day interactions between their children and their teachers. But as Daniel persisted, a few began to open up, sharing small but significant details that echoed Marcus's experiences. One parent mentioned that their child, a girl who excelled in math and science, had stopped participating in class discussions because Mr. Harris never seemed to value her contributions. Another recalled their son coming home one day upset because Mr. Harris had made a disparaging remark about his interests, implying that he shouldn't get his hopes up about a future in technology. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to come together. It wasn't just Marcus. Mr. Harris had a pattern of belittling and discouraging students, particularly those who didn't fit his narrow expectations. Daniel gathered these accounts, carefully documenting everything, and prepared his formal complaint to the school. When he was ready, Daniel made his move. He scheduled a meeting with Principal Robinson, but this time he wasn't going in as just a concerned parent. He was going in as a well-prepared advocate, equipped with evidence and the experiences of other students to support his claims. On the day of the meeting, Daniel and Marcus walked into the principal's office together. Marcus had never been inside the office with his father in this way before. He was used to seeing his dad as a calm, easygoing presence at home, but today Daniel carried himself differently. He was serious, focused, and as Marcus would later realize, quietly powerful. Principal Robinson greeted them, though the tension in the room was palpable. He had likely expected a more routine meeting, but it quickly became clear that Daniel wasn't here for small talk. Mr. Robinson, Daniel began, his tone even but firm, I've come to you today because the situation with Mr. Harris has gone on long enough. I've spoken to several parents and students who have had similar experiences to Marcus, and it's become evident that Mr. Harris's behavior isn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern of discrimination. Principal Robinson's eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his composure. Mr. Jordan, I understand your concern, but these are serious accusations. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation before any decisions are made. I expect nothing less, Daniel replied smoothly, but I also expect transparency throughout this process. I've already documented statements from other students and parents who have witnessed or experienced similar treatment from Mr. Harris. I'll be submitting this documentation along with a formal complaint to the school board. Marcus watched in awe as his father spoke with such authority. Daniel wasn't raising his voice or making threats. He was simply laying out the facts, and the weight of his words was undeniable. Principal Robinson shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. We take all concerns about our staff very seriously, he said carefully. I assure you, this will be investigated thoroughly. Daniel nodded, satisfied with the response for now. That's all I ask. Marcus deserves to learn in an environment where he's treated with respect and given the same opportunities as every other student. The meeting ended on a tense but professional note. As they left the office, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. Relief that his father was taking action, but also lingering doubt. Would the school really do anything? Or would they try to sweep it under the rug? As the days passed, word of the complaint began to spread quietly through the school. The administration started their investigation, interviewing students and teachers who had worked with Mr. Harris. Marcus could feel the undercurrent of tension in the air every time he walked into class, but for the first time, he didn't feel powerless. Mr. Harris, unaware of the full extent of what was happening behind the scenes, continued his usual behavior. But Marcus noticed something different now. He wasn't the same kid who had quietly taken the insults and the subtle slights. Armed with the knowledge that his father had his back and that justice was on the way, Marcus held his head a little higher. He answered questions in class with more confidence, even when Mr. Harris tried to undermine him. One day, during another history lesson, Mr. Harris made a snide remark about Marcus's answer to a question, his tone dripping with condescension. But this time, instead of feeling defeated, Marcus simply smiled and said, "I know what I'm talking about." The class fell silent. Mr. Harris's face tightened, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had nothing to fear anymore. He knew that change was coming. Behind the scenes, Daniel continued to push forward. He worked with the school board, sharing his findings and making it clear that this wasn't an issue that could be ignored. The evidence spoke for itself, and eventually, the weight of it became too much to dismiss. The investigation took several weeks, during which Marcus continued to attend school and do his best in class. It wasn't easy, but each day felt like a small victory. He knew that every time he walked into Mr. Harris's classroom, he was standing up not just for himself, but for every student who had been treated unfairly. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the decision came. Principal Robinson called Daniel and Lisa Jordan into his office, this time without Marcus. When they arrived, Robinson's expression was somber but resigned. "Mr. and Mrs. Jordan," he began, "after a thorough investigation, we've come to the conclusion that Mr. Harris's behavior was, indeed, inappropriate. We've decided to ask him to resign." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained neutral. "That's the right decision," he said. "Thank you for taking the necessary steps." Lisa, though relieved, couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. This victory wasn't just for Marcus. It was for every child who had been made to feel small or insignificant because of someone else's prejudice. But it also highlighted the fact that this kind of injustice was far too common, and far too often it went unchallenged. As they left the office, Daniel put his arm around Lisa's shoulders. "It's over," he said softly. "Marcus won." But as they both knew, the real victory was in the lesson Marcus had learned, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is always worth it. The day after Mr. Harris resigned, the atmosphere at school shifted. Marcus walked into history class with a cautious sense of relief, though the air still felt heavy with unspoken tension. A substitute teacher had been assigned temporarily, and while the classroom felt different without Mr. Harris's looming presence, Marcus knew that the fallout from everything that had happened would take time to settle. His classmates were buzzing with whispers. News of Mr. Harris's resignation had spread quickly, though the official reasons had been kept quiet. There were rumors, speculations, and half-truths flying around. But Marcus remained focused. He had no interest in gossip. He had been through enough, and now that the battle had been fought and won, he was ready to move forward. Still, there was a part of him that couldn't shake the lingering weight of the past few months. The experience had changed him in ways he hadn't fully processed yet. He had learned so much about himself, about the quiet strength he possessed, and about the power of standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. But there was also a deeper awareness, an understanding that prejudice and injustice didn't just disappear with one victory. They were battles that had to be fought again and again, not just for himself, but for others. In the days following Mr. Harris's departure, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the way people interacted with him. His classmates, who had once been oblivious to the struggles he was facing, now treated him with a newfound respect. They had seen him stand up to a teacher, something most of them wouldn't have dared to do, and that act of courage had left an impression. Some of his peers even came up to him quietly between classes, offering words of support. though they hadn't said much during the ordeal. "Hey, Marcus," one of his classmates said as they walked to their lockers after class. "I just wanted to say, what you did was really brave. I don't know if I could have done it." Marcus nodded, unsure of how to respond. He appreciated the sentiment, but he didn't feel particularly brave. In his mind, he had done what anyone should do. He had spoken out when something was wrong. Still, it was nice to hear that people recognized the importance of what had happened. But it wasn't just the students who had changed. Marcus began to notice subtle differences in the way the teachers treated him as well. Some of them seemed more careful, more aware, as though they were realizing for the first time how their words and actions could affect their students. The school administration had implemented diversity and inclusion training, something Marcus's father had quietly pushed for during his conversations with the school board. The ripple effect of Mr. Harris's actions and Marcus's stand was beginning to take hold. One afternoon, as Marcus sat quietly in the library, working on an essay for another class, he thought about how everything had unfolded. The pain of those first few weeks, the hurtful comments, the dismissive tone, the feeling of being underestimated, had all led to this moment. It hadn't been easy, but there was a sense of justice now, a balance that had been restored, and with that balance came a sense of peace. But the story didn't end with Mr. Harris's resignation. The real lesson Marcus had learned wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about the power of karma, the idea that our actions, good or bad, always come back to us in ways we might not expect. Karma had a way of rippling outwards, affecting not just the person who had done wrong, but everyone around them. And now, in the wake of what had happened, Marcus could see how those ripples were touching everything. The students who had witnessed Mr. Harris's behavior, some of whom had stayed silent, others who had quietly supported Marcus, were now more aware of their own actions. They began to think more carefully about the way they treated others, understanding that their words and attitudes had consequences. The teachers, too, seemed to carry a new sense of responsibility, knowing that they had the power to shape their students' experiences, for better or worse. Even Principal Robinson, who had initially hesitated to take Marcus's concerns seriously, seemed to have undergone a quiet transformation. He had been forced to confront his own biases, his own complicity in allowing someone like Mr. Harris to operate unchecked for so long. And while he hadn't admitted it openly, Marcus could see that the principal now looked at him with a mix of respect and regret. The situation had been a wake-up call for him as well. A few weeks later, as the dust finally began to settle, Marcus sat down to write an essay, an assignment for his new history teacher. The topic was one that resonated deeply with him: leadership and the power of individuals to create change. Marcus smiled as he began typing, the words flowing naturally from his thoughts. He decided to write about karma, not the mystical, otherworldly version of karma often talked about, but the practical, everyday kind. The idea that our actions have consequences and that what we put out into the world eventually comes back to us. He thought about how Mr. Harris had underestimated him, dismissed him, and belittled him, only to face the consequences of his own actions. But more importantly, Marcus thought about how his own courage, his decision to speak up when things were wrong, had created a ripple of positive change. In his essay, Marcus wrote about the civil rights leaders he admired, people who had stood up against injustice and discrimination despite the personal risks. He wrote about how their actions had not only changed laws and policies, but also inspired others to look inward and examine their own beliefs and behaviors. And he wrote about how the smallest acts of courage could lead to the biggest changes, because courage, like karma, had a way of rippling outwards. When Marcus finished the essay, he read over it, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This time, when he turned in his work, he wasn't nervous about the feedback he might receive. He wasn't seeking approval or validation. He knew his worth now, and no teacher's comment could take that away from him. The new history teacher, Miss Taylor, was a breath of fresh air compared to Mr. Harris. She treated all of her students with respect and encouraged open dialogue in the classroom. When she handed Marcus's essay back to him a week later, there was a simple note at the bottom: "Powerful work. You should be proud." Marcus smiled as he read the note, but this time, he didn't need the praise to feel validated. He already knew that what he had written mattered, not because of the grade or the teacher's comments, but because it was his truth. At home, his parents couldn't have been prouder. Lisa beamed when she read Marcus's essay, and Daniel, though always a man of few words, pulled his son into a rare, tight hug. "You did good, kid," he said softly. "You did real good." That night, as Marcus lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He had faced one of the hardest challenges of his life, and though it hadn't been easy, he had come out stronger on the other side. He thought about Mr. Harris, about the impact that one person's negative actions could have on the people around them. But more importantly, he thought about the impact that positive actions could have, the way standing up for what was right could inspire others to do the same. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Karma wasn't just about punishment or reward, Marcus realized. It was about the ripples we create with every choice, every word, every action. And if we wanted the world to be better, it was up to us to make those ripples count. As Marcus drifted off to sleep, he smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. The ripples of karma were still spreading, and he was ready to keep pushing them forward, one act of courage at a time. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.